Hi, I'm Kevin Thomas, W1DED, and this is Q5 Ham Radio. Today I'm joined by someone whose name has quietly echoed through nearly every corner of the contesting world. From the era of K1EA and W2PV to today's multi-op giants like K3LR, Doug Grant K1DG has been at the center of some of the most memorable moments in ham radio history. He's operated from over 30 countries, competed in 6 WRTCs, helped organize the Boston WRTC in 2014, and helped launch WWROF to ensure contesting's future. He still holds the USA record for CQ160, and while he stepped back from all-out single-operator efforts, he continues to compete. Whether you've heard his name at Contest University or just noticed it on a plaque in the shack, Doug's impact runs deep. But first, a quick thank you to DX Engineering, proud sponsors of Q5 Ham Radio, for supporting contesters, DXers, POTA activators, and portable operators around the world. Doug, welcome to Q5.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks for having me.
So you said off camera that you didn't really have much of a story to tell, but even in that intro, there's plenty of story. And as I was doing my research and talking to various people, I just know we're not going to be able to cover all the ground, even in one conversation. So this will be the beginner's guide to Doug Grant K1DG, okay?
Okay, sure.
So let's start with where you decided, when you decided to get your license, where you were at the time, and what motivated you.
Well, we have to go back, and I just thought about this for a minute. We have to go back 60 years. Back in January 1965, I was in Boy Scouts, and I was subscribing to a magazine called Boy's Life. And in one of the issues in January 65, there was a little construction article on how to build a crystal radio. And I looked at that and said, oh, that doesn't look too hard. And I was pretty good at building stuff. So I gave it a shot, and my parents helped me collect some of the parts. And I heard some of the Boston area radio stations. And I was just astounded that this collection of random little bits and pieces could actually bring in a radio station with no power and no anything else. So one thing led to another. I had to build a better one and a better one and a better one. And one day I was tuning on one of my newer creations, and apparently the antenna was just the right length that I heard Voice of America from Greenville, South Carolina. And I said, this is not a Boston area AM station. I don't know what this is. So I asked my parents. They weren't quite sure. They asked someone, finally figured out it was a shortwave station. And I said, okay, I got to get into this. So I eventually talked my parents into buying me a shortwave radio, and I became a shortwave listener. I heard all the big international broadcast stations, and one day I was tuning around near the 16-meter broadcast band, and I heard two guys talking to each other. And one was in Texas and one was in England, and that just blew me away. And I knew then I had to get into the game. So eventually my parents found a ham who could give me the novice license. Back then you had to have another ham. They didn't have the volunteer examiner program and so forth. It was just an individual ham. And my next door neighbor, who was a retired Navy man, taught me Morse code. So I passed that, then passed the license. And in June of 1967, I got my novice license.
So clearly you had very supportive parents. I take it they weren't ham radio operators themselves. They just had an interest in supporting your passion.
Yeah, they weren't hams. They neither one went to college. My father never finished high school. So it was, I guess you might say, a humble beginning. But they would find the resources that I needed and supported me with what I needed. Now, I was one of those kids that was kind of nerdy. I wasn't really great at sports or anything in school, but I was pretty good academically. And after my 1-year non-renewable novice license expired, with a grand total of 26 QSOs in the log, I went into the FCC office in Boston to take the general class exam, and I failed the code test. And that was traumatic because I'd never failed any test in my life. So I decided that once I finally did pass my general code test, I was going to slay that dragon. I was going to practice CW. I was going to get better at it. And eventually, I guess I did.
So you mentioned the Boston field office. Where did you live at the time?
I was living in suburban Boston, a little town called Canton, just outside Boston.
And where was the FCC office where you took the test?
A lot of the old timers here in New England will recognize that 1600 Custom House, the 16th floor of the Custom House building in Boston, was where the exams were given. And it was fairly daunting. At the time I was 13 years old, and had to take a bus to a streetcar to a train, and eventually find my way up to the 16th floor.
Well, the reason I'm asking is I'd forgotten about this, but when I was a freshman in college, I took a bus down to Boston. I went to the Custom House building to get my advanced license, and it was quite an experience. I mean, I was a little bit older than you, but that building is just so impressive. And I couldn't believe that I was standing outside this particular building to take my test. So that's a great memory. Thank you for bringing it back for me.
Well, I had some pretty bad memories of that building, but it turns out it's now been bought by the Marriott, and it's a condo thing, so you can actually buy units there. And I thought about it and said, no, I don't think so.
So when you made those first 26 QSOs, I'm sort of curious what you were using for radio. What did you have?
Oh, it was pathetic. The transmitter was a thing called a Konar 400, which was a little one tube, basically oscillator, which ran about 25 watts or something like that, and was sold by the National Radio Institute, I think it was, as part of their course, but you could also buy it outside their course. And they advertised in QST and Popular Electronics, and so that's what I had. My receiver at the time, I think, I started with a Hallicrafters 4-tube radio that I used as an SWL, and then I graduated to a Radio Shack DX150, which had transistors in it, and it was also a terrible receiver. I didn't know what I was doing for an antenna, so I had kind of a random length wire, and thank God for sporadic E, because if it wasn't for that, a lot of the contacts on 15 meters never would have happened. They never would have heard me. I never would have heard them.
So given that scenario, 26 QSOs is pretty good for you. That wasn't much of a setup, so good job with that, Doug. Tell me when the contesting bug hit you. Was that early on, or was that much later in your ham radio journey?
Well, it took a while. When I first got on HF and was out to get better at CW, some of my friends had gotten involved in traffic handling on the 80-meter CW National Traffic System traffic nets. And that was pretty good, because even with a terrible station and a lousy antenna, I was sort of guaranteed of making at least one QSO every night by just checking into the net. And I copied a lot of the traffic, whether it was for me or for someone else. So I started doing CW. When the net was over, I would go up to 75-meter sideband and talk to some of the guys who were my peers. And that time, a lot of us in high school, a lot of the nerdy kids who today would get into computer stuff were getting into ham radio. So we somehow all found each other, and we would yak on 75 meters. And occasionally there would be contests that we would hear. Then one day I was listening on 40 CW, and there was a guy just really ripping along, going very fast, working guys really quick. And I said, I wonder what this is all about. So I looked up the rules and kind of figured out and started making a few contacts.
So you had a peer group that you just explained, so people your age that were also into ham radio. But who did you look up to as a mentor? Or was there somebody that you looked up to that had been in ham radio for a while?
Well, I guess what happened was I tripped over a contest club in the New England area called Murphy's Marauders, based in Connecticut. And those guys were very welcoming to all of us high school kids who didn't know anything and didn't have any money and didn't have any decent radios. And they kind of took us under their wings and taught us a lot. They invited us to field day. And one of the guys who was probably my biggest mentor was K1RX, who back in the day was WB2YEW. And when I was looking around for what college to go to after high school, of the colleges that I got accepted to, the club at the University of Lowell or now UMass Lowell, seemed to be the most active, had the best signal, so I decided I would go there. And Mark was 2 years ahead of me in school there, so he taught me a lot about contesting there, and lessons that I learned to this day. And what's interesting is Mark and I have stayed connected for that whole time. He taught me how to climb towers and do antenna work. And just last week, he was helping me do some antenna work out at N1LI. So it's been a long time we've been climbing together and friends together.
I had a great conversation with Mark while I was at Turks and Caicos as VP5E, and he had some great tips on contesting. That particular video has been very well received, so I totally respect that connection you have with him. Do you recall, Doug, your first serious contest that you got involved with, and what was that like? Was that a single operator? Were you working with somebody else?
My first serious contest. Well, it depends. If you mean serious for me, there was an intra-club competition in the Murphy's Marauders group, and I was paired up against WA1JZC, who was one of my better friends, now K1RT, not very active. And they paired us up to compete against each other in the phone sweepstakes in 1971, I guess. And I made 400 contacts, and I thought that was just astounding. After that, going off to college, there were a lot of interesting operations. I was invited to go out to W2PV, the big multi of the day. They were trolling, Jim was trolling around for operators and was trying to tap into the Murphy's Marauders group. Fred K2TR invited me out, and I started as the low man on the totem pole as the 160-meter phone operator in the phone CQ Worldwide. And there were very low expectations. And when I actually worked a couple of Europeans, they were suitably impressed that I was able to have enough perseverance with just 100 watts, because that was the power limit on 160 in those days. So operating at W2PV was cool. The operators there, K2TR, K2SS, were legends, and being able to sit next to them and listen to them operate was just great. And eventually, I worked my way up and became a 40-meter CW and 15-meter phone operator at that station, which was really terrific.
Doug, I don't want to get too far off of ham radio, but I am curious, given your interest in building as a kid, did you take that track professionally also?
Yeah, I went into electrical engineering. That's why I went to Lowell Tech, as it was called at the time. When I went there, I actually had been doing some software stuff in high school, and I found writing computer programs was kind of fun. It turned out that Lowell Tech was more hardware focused than software focused, so I kind of put software aside for a very long time, and eventually professionally worked in the semiconductor industry. Never really got back to software, which kind of leaves me out of a lot of what's going on today, but that's okay. There's still plenty of hardware to build and plenty of operating to do.
Well, I love that the hobby led to a career path. I was just talking to Tom Jorgens the other day, W2SC, and he gave the same story, that ham radio helped him on his path and his career. So I think it's always encouraging. So let's get back to contesting. One of the things that amazed me about your track record is the amount of countries you've operated from and the amount of call signs that you've operated under. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist somewhere else, but I've talked to 150 people now on the show, and I don't know there's anybody that matches this. Tell me about that. How did that happen? Was there an interest in traveling? You know, what allowed you to operate from 30 countries and be invited to all these stations? Just your charming personality?
Yeah, obviously, my charming personality and so forth. Well, it goes back to when I was a kid. We didn't, my family didn't travel very much, but I was fascinated with geography. I had a globe and lots of atlases, and I was just amazed at this big world we live in. After I graduated from college, got a job, needed a place to live, and my friend K1MM had bought a house and was looking for someone to rent a room. So I rented a room at his house. We put up a tower and some beams. And one day he came to me and said, "Hey, let's go on a de-expedition for the CQ Worldwide." And I said, "Okay, sure. Where?" He said, "Well, there hasn't been much activity from Guadeloupe. Let's go there." So being being dumb young guys who didn't know any better, we packed a suitcase full of coax cable, wiring antennas, and tore out the Guadeloupe page from the call book, and flew down to Guadeloupe, arrived at night, found a hotel. The next morning we got up and said, okay, which one of these call signs have we actually heard on the air? And looked at the address, rented a car, and drove and knocked on the door, literally. And we said, well, we're here to operate the contest. And after a few, we didn't get the door slammed in our faces. They were very polite. And one guy said, well, you can't operate here, but I know a guy. And he turned us on to a guy who owned a hotel and a small restaurant and had a tri-bander up. And we went over there and he said, yeah, sure, you can stay here. You can operate the contest. And that was pretty cool. Being on the DX end of a pileup was pretty amazing. We didn't do great in the contest, but it was enough to set the hook. Some years later, when I was looking for another place to operate, in 1979, K1AR and I went to the Dominican Republic. We were invited by some people we had met there who had a station. And we borrowed a call sign from K1MM, who had an HI8 call, HI8XWP. Try saying that 10,000 times real fast. And so we got on, and just John and I hit the bands really hard, and turns out we broke the world record for a multi-single with just the two of us, one radio, a tri-bander, and some wires from a 2-point country. So that was pretty exciting to be able to pull that one off. So that was, I guess, maybe our first really serious one, first really serious one from overseas. That got me invited to a few places, and one thing just led to another. And going to all those different places, I made up that list a while back because I was curious how many different call signs I'd used, and I was kind of surprised. But I fell in with the group that had the big station on Bonaire, which wore the call signs PJ1B, PJ4B, PJ9B, PJ9E. K3EST was sort of the ringleader of that group and got me invited there, and that was a lot of fun. So I found myself sort of bouncing around between doing single ops from somewhere in the US and multi-ops from overseas, and I'm still doing it. I kind of like to mix it up. I've done multi-single, multi-two, multi-multi, and they've all been fun.
So as I predicted, there's a lot of different directions we can go here, but I need to stop for a second and just admire you and your buddy's ability to get on a plane, head to Guadeloupe, and not have a plan. I mean, the people I talk to nowadays, like Greg Marco, W6IZT, there's a lot of preparation to go into DXpeditions, a lot of planning. A lot of times they're 6 months to a year in advance, and you guys just packing up your luggage and going and knocking on doors. That's pretty impressive. And actually, I think there's a lesson there because sometimes we just need to start from where we are and see how it all unfolds. So congratulations on that. One of the things I'm curious about, Doug, when you're traveling around to all these stations, was part of the reason that you did that for the experience of operating from a different location or for the station itself? And part of that question is, what did you have for a station at home at the time? Did you have a competitive contest station at home?
Well, I had a station at home. How competitive it was is going to lead into a different discussion that I know we'll get into. But I did have a station at home, but the travel bug has always been there. And, I've gotten to the point where if there's a station that looks interesting in a place I haven't been, I'm not bashful about inviting myself. And that's opened a lot of doors, and a lot of other people have invited me. I guess I've developed some sort of a reputation as an operator, and people call me up and say, hey, we're going to be doing an operation here. Would you like to come down? One interesting one, I usually operate the CQ Worldwide CW from home, because it usually falls on Thanksgiving weekend. And Thanksgiving is kind of a big deal in my family. But every once in a while, the calendar lines up so that the last full weekend of November is not Thanksgiving weekend. Trey Garlow, N5KO, had this big station down in the Galapagos, HC8N. And he invited me a bunch of times, and I said, Thanksgiving weekend, can't do it. And one year he called me up in January and said, "Hey, look at the calendar. This is one of those years. Are you coming down or what?" And so that was an invitation that I couldn't refuse, and turned out to be a really terrific time and quite an experience.
So before we leave the number of countries you've operated from, you've actually set foot in over 100 DXCC countries. Tell me about that.
Well, I traveled a lot on business and, of course, the contesty expeditions. And one day I tripped over a website called DXFC.org, which was organized by GM4, now G4AFF. And it doesn't cost anything to join. And it's just kind of a fun thing for hams who like to travel. And using the DXCC list, you can enter in countries that you've been to. And when I signed up for it initially, I found out I was somewhere around 75 countries. And I said, well, getting to 100 is not impossible. So that sort of became a factor in where I invited myself to go operate for contests. I tried to go to places that were countries I haven't been to, and finally got up to, I'm up to 104 now on that list. And my wife, who's my partner in crime, is at 92. So we need to do a little catching up to get her over 100 too.
So Doug, with your history and the number of places you've operated from, it may be difficult for you to tell me the most memorable experience, but give the audience an example of a memorable contest experience that you had away from Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, there have been a bunch. I was on a business trip some years ago for a convention or a conference that was held every year in Spain, and EA5RS contacted me and said, "Hey, why don't if you're coming next year, why don't you come over here and operate?" And I said, "Well, I'll come and operate if you can get a special call sign." And he said, "Well, what call sign should I get?" I said, "I want you to get EE5E, which on CW is the shortest possible amateur call sign." And he said, "Oh no, they won't do it. They don't do 2x1 special calls." I said, "Well, okay, Well, it took him a year, and a week before the contest, he dropped me an email and said, I can't believe it, but they gave us a call sign. Come on over." So after the conference was over, I took a flight down to his house and operated as EE5E, which was a very interesting call sign to use. Half the people we worked loved it and half hated it. But that was pretty memorable. Operating from VP2E in 2004 was another one. I kind of invited myself there. There was a very big station owned by a couple of guys from Texas, and I got myself invited there through N5TJ, who knew all those guys. And I said, "Oh, by the way, can I bring a friend? Can I bring Andy, N2NT?" And we did a multi-two operation, again from a 2-point country, and we set the world record. And that record's been standing for over 2 decades now. And it was a great team, a great station. Conditions were great, and everything was just amazing. The V47T operations that I've been at with N2NT have been also memorable. That station plays very, very well, and Andy and I go back a long ways. We were the 15-meter phone operators at W2PV, and
well, it's also memorable because it's practically camping, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fairly rustic. I'll leave it at that.
I've heard that from Andy and from Randy. It's an experience. So, Doug, one of the questions that comes to mind, I just got off this conversation with Tom Georgian's W2SC, who operates as 8 Papa 5 Alpha. His contest activity is almost exclusively from there. So when he goes back, he understands the station. He's constantly tweaking it. You, on the other hand, are getting on a plane, going to different stations a lot. And I'm just wondering what that experience is like to have to adapt to a different station every time, whatever they have for technology, radios, antennas. What is that like? I mean, have you been doing it just so long that it's almost intuitive to you, or is there a period of time it takes you to actually acclimate to the new station?
Well, it takes a little bit of time. I like to get to a place at least a couple of days early so I can get used to the radios. I went to P40L a couple of years ago and invited myself there. And when I showed up, they said, "Okay, well, we have 2 stations here. This one over here is K3, and this one over here is a K4. And the other two operators who were on site said, "We have K3s at home, so we're going to use that. You can use this K4." And I'd never sat in front of one of those things before. So that took a little bit of learning, and but after a couple of hours playing with it, it was fine. I mean, the fact of the matter is, in contesting, there are only a few knobs you need to be able to figure out how to use. The big one in the middle, the RF gain, maybe some filtering, and all that stuff's pretty intuitive on most of the newer radios. There have been challenges. There have been times when I've sat in front of a radio and said, "I have no idea how to use this thing." And then the station owner would come over, give me a few tips, and I'd get there. I think it probably held back my development as a single op, operating so many different stations, because I never really got to know my own station very well until I took the big plunge and built a station up in Maine.
So before we leave these trips to various stations, I'm intrigued by the fact that you did use a lot of different equipment, so you must have an opinion on which radios you prefer. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Which radios did you have the best experience with?
Well, gee, if this was live, I could go out for the highest bidder from all the manufacturers, because I know most of those guys, and see who's willing to put up some money for an endorsement. The fact of the matter is, in talking with Rob Sherwood, who evaluates lots of different radios and rates all the receivers, and now is doing a lot of work on transmitters, his basic view is that most radios from the last 10 years are perfectly adequate for contesting. You won't make a lot more contacts from most stations if you have a radio that's number 72 on his list instead of number 1. It won't make any difference. And I think he's right. My own preference is for radios with knobs on them. I don't like too many bells and whistles. I've used all the way back to Drake's. I've had Kenwood's, Yaesu's. I won the CQ Worldwide several times with radios that were more than 10 years old, using an FT1000 and an IC781. K1DG, who is another one of my mentors, once made a comment that those radios belong in a museum, not on a contest station. So the radio is not really the big differentiator. So I'll use almost anything.
You and Randy K5ZD are speaking from the same hymn book here, so that answer could have been his answer. So thank you for that. You had mentioned earlier John Doerr, K1AR, and I don't know if you mentioned this, but he's your brother-in-law. And I've been back in the hobby long enough that people actually say you're like brothers, that you're that tight, and you're both great contesters. Tell me about that relationship. Were you both ham radio operators when you met, and were you both contesters when you met, or did one of them contribute to the other's path?
Well, I met John on the air, talking in the afternoons on 40-meter sideband after school. I was 2 years ahead of him in school, and when I went off to college, he was just starting to think about colleges to apply to, and I suggested that the place that I was going to college had a pretty good ham station, which was obviously important to both of us, and was a pretty good school with a pretty good reputation. It was a state school, so it was fairly cheap. And his parents checked it out and decided, yeah, he could apply there. And so eventually he came to school there. So I was 2 years ahead of him, so I was going into my junior year when he showed up as a freshman. And so I showed him around. He was mostly a DXer at the time, but had discovered that you can work a lot of DX if you get on certain weekends of the year in contests. So we did a lot of contesting at the club station at the school. We were both in Murphy's Marauders and later the Yankee Clipper Contest Club. I got John invited out to W2PV, and we went out there together a lot of times. He usually did 20 and I did 15. And there's sort of a funny story. I started going out with this girl, and things were going along pretty well. And she said, I have a couple of sisters. And I said, all right, well, why don't we get together with some of my friends from college, and they can meet, and maybe there'll be a connection there. And there was. It turns out John's roommate really liked Karen's middle sister, and they were going to be going out on a date. And then he couldn't make the date because there was an opportunity for a summer job. So John had to stand in. Um, he did a pretty good job of it, apparently. And
The rest is history.
the rest is history. John and Barbara got married, and Karen and I got married. And it's been great because on certain weekends of the year, they can go shopping or go visit family or whatever, and John and I can disappear and play radio.
So I live in Maine. In Yarmouth, Maine, Little John Island. I'm always looking for Maine connections. And lo and behold, when I started looking into your call sign a couple of years ago, I noticed that you had a station on Long Island, Maine. Not the Long Island, New York, but Long Island, Maine. Tell me about that. How long have you had that, and what was the kind of the impetus to do that?
Well, it started with nothing to do with ham radio, actually. Um, we had a friend from our church who had a property on Little Diamond Island, also in Casco Bay, and the Dorr family and the Grant family used to go up there for a week every summer with all of our kids, and it was terrific. We really enjoyed it. And one year I looked at my wife and said, it would be nice to have a place up here of our own instead of renting every year. And she agreed. So we looked around at the various islands, and um, as you know, each island has a little bit different character out there. And one day at work, I was in a colleague's office, and he had the nautical chart of Casco Bay on his wall, and I looked at it and said, "Hey, I was just up there. I was on Little Diamond Island." And he said, "Well, 2 islands over on Long Island is where I've spent every summer of my entire life." So my friend Paul introduced me around to some people there, and my wife and I started looking at some properties, and we found some land and built a house on the northeast corner of the island facing Europe, which was kind of nice.
Just by chance.
Just by chance. So we built a house in 2006 and put up a tower that same year with a few antennas. I decided I should have a distinctive call sign there, and I found out that N1LI was available, so I formed the Long Island DX Society Radio Club and got the call sign and put up a station. And lo and behold, I found out that all those legends about saltwater being magic, especially on the low bands, all that stuff's true. And the station plays extraordinarily well.
So was that your primary, I'll call it home QTH? Is that where you operated primarily from?
Yeah, I had a home station here in New Hampshire, and I could pretty routinely make the top 10 in most of the DX contests. I won the ARL DX contest one year, but I could never really crack into the top tier in the CQ Worldwide, and it turned out that I was just getting sand kicked in my face on the low bands all the time. So when I got the place up in Maine, I found out that I could be one of the loud guys on the low bands. So instead of doing great during the day and taking the pipe at night, I could run guys all night long on 80 and 160. And so that became my primary contest operating place for more than 10 years, from about 2007 or 8 up until just a few years ago. And I evolved the station by improving antennas where I thought I needed some additional muscle on the high bands. And we had some great competitions from while I was operating out there. There was one year in the CQ Worldwide CW where 4 of us broke the record and had scores within 1% of each other. And it was just a great competition.
And what does the future hold for the Long Island station?
Well, as time has evolved, Father Time keeps turning those pages in the calendar, and in order to stay competitive, I would have to develop the 2B SIQ skill. And as I tell people, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So I think that was probably where I decided I was likely to be done. My station never really had all of the interstation interference problems knocked down to where I could CQ on 2 bands at the same time. So I decided that was time to hang it up. And between that and the maintenance issues of a big station, by the time I was done, the antenna complement there on the high bands was 6/6/6 on 10 meters, 5/5/5 on 15, and 4/4 on 20. two elements on 40 and wires on 80 and 160. And that's a lot to maintain as a single op guy. It's hard to get antenna work help out on an island when they have to take a ferry to get there. I've been lucky to have some great helpers, K1RX, for example. Randy came out a number of times, K5ZD, when he was still living here, but it's a lot to ask for him to come out from Ohio to help me do antenna work. So I've kind of downsized, or as they would say in corporate speak, right-sized the station for what I'm doing now. I don't really need a hardcore single op station. Now it's kind of a fun run station. I have a stack of 2 tri-banders and a 2 element 40, the same wires in the trees, so I can get on the 160 contest and be competitive when the sunspot cycle is down. I love doing the IOTA contest, the Islands on the Air contest from out there, because being in a semi-rare island group, you're a multiplier, and it's like being in the Caribbean almost. And the station now has some issues with nearby noise generators. Some of the people who had cottages there that were summer cottages have now converted them to year-round, and they brought all their consumer electronics and noise generators and things like that. So the station is now in the right-sizing mode.
Well, you didn't mention this, but saltwater also is a blessing and a curse. Obviously, we know what the blessing is with propagation, but is a curse maintaining antennas and towers in that kind of salt air.
Oh, yeah. There's some hardware on that tower that taught me the lesson of stainless steel to aluminum corrosion in a saltwater environment. And there's some hardware on that tower that's just never going to come off because it's so crusted over. I did learn a lot about using stainless hardware on instead of plated. And fortunately, the tower has been up for a long time. And when it came time to take the monobanders down, they came down mostly without a hitch because I learned the lessons of how to build a station in that environment.
So, Doug, you run with a pretty advanced contester crowd. I mean, everybody within your circle are excellent contesters. But I'd like to know your advice to people that are starting contesting today. Maybe they're intermediate contesters. What's your best advice for somebody that enjoys ham radio, enjoys contesting, aren't at your and John's level yet, but maybe they would like to be?
Well, I think I would say get on the air and get on the air a lot. That's how you really learn. You'll eventually learn operating techniques, especially if you have a small station. You'll learn how to get through big pileups by timing your calls. I think you don't need to rely so much on the technology. I think it's more the wetware, the stuff between your ears, that's the biggest tool that you can use in contesting. You know, I started out with a crummy station, and eventually improved my station, improved my skills, kind of in parallel the long way, or the whole time I've been doing this. But I remember back to one of my field days with the local radio club, and I've told this story before. The most important contest lesson I ever learned, ever, was from a guy who wasn't even a contester. He was K1HHN at the time, later became W9HG. He's now a silent key. He was sort of the best operator in the Norwood Amateur Radio Club. He did phone, he did CW, and his CW was music, and his phone operating was like poetry. And I was sitting next to him on 40 sideband, and he was just running guys, and then turned to me and said, "All right, kid, you want to try it?" And I said, "Okay, yeah, sure." And I was very tense and very nervous, and I was talking too fast. And he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Kid, relax. This is supposed to be fun. Take it easy." And that's the best advice I ever had. And that's the advice I would give to anybody who's trying to work their way up the ranks in contesting and become competitive. It's not about having the fanciest radio, the biggest antenna, the best location. All that stuff's great. But if you're not having fun, you're kind of missing what it's all about. This is a hobby after all.
So, Doug, as a veteran contester, and I don't mean age, I'm just you're talented. You've been doing it a long time. I'm curious who you see to be the up and coming contesters, the young upstarts that impress you.
Oh boy. Well, Well, some of the guys that I have thought about as the up and coming guys have now come up and are here. I've watched guys like N6MJ and KL9A develop from beginner contests. I remember getting emails from Chris when he was still living in Alaska. He heard me in a sprint and he sent me an email saying, "Hey, I heard you. Why did you do this?" So he was sending emails and asking questions, and I've had the opportunity to operate with him, and boy, he's really good. I haven't operated with Dan very much, but I've sat across the room from him and watched him operate, and these guys are really good. Some of the guys that they are mentoring now are coming along pretty well. I've watched NN1C develop from a kid who wanted to learn how to play the game to someone who's now a highly skilled station builder and station operator. Some of the youth that K3LR has invited out to his station, I think they're going to develop their skills and become pretty good over the coming decades. So they're out there, I've sort of tried to give back a little bit by doing things at Contest University, teaching courses there, and teaching seminars here and there, giving talks at various radio clubs to try and mentor some of these new guys along, and hopefully that's working.
So, Doug, I'm looking at the clock, and as predicted, we're just not going to be able to cover all the ground I wanted to. I mean, we haven't got into your role with the WWROF, which I think is super impressive. Your role with the WRTC, not only as a competitor, but as an organizer. So you got to promise to come back in the future, okay?
Sure, I can do that. One of the things you said you wanted to talk about also was the sort of the future of ham radio and the future of contesting. And I think I like a lot of the technology that's being developed, but I think I want to see people, particularly in contesting, focus more on operating. One of my favorite contests is the North American Sprint, which is a 4-hour contest that is entirely an operating event. You can't use you can't use things like spotting nets. Self-spotting doesn't help. None of the technologies that people are relying on now are of any benefit at all. It's strictly an operator event, an accuracy-based thing, and I think that's something that people should look into and try and improve their skills. I'm very proud of having had a couple of golden logs, which means 0 errors in a sprint, and that's kind of my goal at this point. As far as the future of ham radio, I hope HF and HF contesting will survive and evolve and still be popular. It's still magic to me doing things on the low bands where you can literally hear the earth turning. As the gray line crosses on the low bands, you hear stations in Russia get loud and then they disappear, and stations in Eastern Europe get loud, then they disappear, and so forth, right across the continent. And that's a very cool thing. And I also think that we don't want to miss the social aspect of ham radio. You mentioned that I tend to run with a crowd of certain people, and that's true. We all have the common interest in radio, but one of my mentors, K1DG's, has on his website something that I'm going to put on my tombstone, and paraphrasing it says, "Ham radio has been my primary hobby for many, many years. Through this hobby, I have met many extraordinary people who I otherwise would not have met. They know who they are, and they know who I am." Can't get better than that.
That's a great way to close. I really appreciate it, Doug. Thank you for taking time today.
You're welcome. See you later.
My name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. This is Q5 Ham Radio. I've been talking to Doug Grant, K1DG. I'm sure you know the call sign, and I'm sure you'll hear it soon on the air. 73.